On June 7, 1944, organized resistance by the Imperial Japanese Army on the island of Saipan had virtually collapsed. The battle had been raging for 22 days, and the beleaguered Japanese garrison, once some 31,000 strong, had been driven back by the combined forces of the United States Army, Marines, and Navy to a tiny corner of the island. Further defense was futile, but the commanding general, Yoshitsugu Saito, refused to surrender and instead gave a chilling last command. Despite the bitterness of defeat, we pledge 7 lives to repay our country. What he meant was that all the surviving officers, men, and even civilian employees of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy on the island were expected to die the next day in a suicide attack in which each was expected to kill 7 Americans. They planned a mass yokusai, or human swarm, of some 3,000 men, the largest of what the Americans called bonsai attacks of the war. In the action that followed, 3 Americans would be awarded medals of honor for acts of extreme bravery, but one of those would raise controversy to the point that it was delayed in its award for some 58 years. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Ben Salomon was the only child of middle-class Jewish parents, born September 1, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Described as athletic and popular with his classmates, he graduated from Shorewood High School in Milwaukee suburb of Shorewood in 1932. A Boy Scout, he had achieved the rank of Eagle Scout. He attended a local Milwaukee university, Marquette, but transferred to the University of Southern California. He wanted to become a dentist from an early age and secured entry into the USC Dental School. It would have been difficult. At the time, the University of Southern California operated a quota system called numerus clausus that limited the number of Jewish students allowed entry into the medical, law, and dental schools. Still, he gained admission and graduated in 1937. He went into dental practice in California. In November of 1940, in anticipation of war, the United States began the first peacetime draft in the nation's history. Ben, then 26 years old, was one of the first to be drafted. He was assigned to the infantry, a private in the 102nd Infantry Regiment. He was a good soldier. According to the Army medical historian, after basic training, Ben joined the 102nd Infantry Regiment and quickly proved to be a natural soldier and leader. He won awards as an expert rifle and pistol marksman, and his commanding officer stated that he was the best all-around soldier in the regiment. He was promoted to sergeant and made head of a machine gun section. However, he was still a dentist. Dr. Carl Jobst, DDS, explains, at the same time he was giving informal dental checkups and cleanings to the other men in his battalion. Word got around, and he was commissioned into the Dental Corps in 1942. Apparently eager to shoot the enemy rather than fix teeth, Salomon tried to refuse this commission. His commanding officer in the 102nd sought instead to gain him a commission as a second lieutenant in the infantry. But the Army was short of dentists, and he was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Army Medical Corps in 1942. He was made regimental dentist of the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 27th Infantry Division. HistoryNet described the position in Hawaii as a fairly cushy job that promised little combat action. Despite not being a requirement for an Army dentist, Salomon was known for going on runs and hikes and other physical training with the soldiers of the battalion. Captain Edmund Love, the 27th regimental historian, said of him, "He wallowed in the dirt and the mud. He made the long, hot hikes. He fired on the range." The regiment's commander, Colonel Leonard Bishop, said of him, "Ben Salomon was the best instructor in infantry tactics we ever had. He gave everyone who ever met him a real lift. He had a way of inspiring people to do things that they might not have done otherwise. I think it was because he himself was the most vital man most of us ever met." Salomon could have stayed out of combat, but when the regiment was sent to the bloody fight on the island of Saipan in mid-June 1944, one of the regimental surgeons was injured, and on June 22nd, Salomon volunteered to take his place. HistoryNet writes, a natural leader, probably because of his down-to-earth demeanor and innate courage, he quickly earned the loyalty of the battalion medics. One of his men, Tech 3 Vincent Danilo, described him as a swell guy. He pitched in like one of the boys in the aid station. Though Salomon had never attended medical school, he proved himself to be a highly competent combat surgeon. Indeed, he enjoyed his new job so much that he confided to one friend his intention to become a medical doctor after the war. "He told me he wanted to be the best surgeon that ever lived," his friend later recalled. The night of July 6, 1944, Salomon was in charge of an aid station, just 50 yards behind the line. Larry DeKers, a curator at the U.S. World War II Museum, described the 105th position that night. After 3 weeks of fighting on Saipan, 2/3 of the island was in U.S. hands. The 2nd Marine Division, the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, and the 4th Marine Division had advanced northward from landing beaches in the southwest and driven the Japanese into the northern corner of the island. 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, were the westernmost units of the line by the evening of July 6. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien's 1st Battalion was dug in about 250 yards from the beach, and Major Edward McCarthy's 2nd Battalion held the line from the 1st Battalion's left flank to the beach. O'Brien was aware of a gap in the line between 1st and 2nd Battalion and requested reinforcements, but none were available. O'Brien tried to shore up the hole in the line by positioning his anti-tank weapons to cover the gap. Marine Corps Captain John C. Saipan had been part of the difficult fighting with the 2nd Marine Division. Experience had taught him that the Japanese were as dangerous in defeat as they were in victory. He later wrote, "Once the 2nd Marine Division became Corps Reserve, it was obvious to General Smith that the time was ripe for a Banzai attack. He duly warned all units to be alert and paid a personal visit on 6 July to General Greiner of the 27th Infantry Division to stress the likelihood of an attack coming down the coastline on the flat ground of the Tanpeng Plain." The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, knew that the end was near. In his final orders, he told his men, "We now have no material with which to fight, and our artillery for attack has been completely destroyed." Saipan explained, General Saito was now cornered in his 6th and last command post, a miserable cave in Paradise Valley north of Tanapag. The valley was constantly raked by American artillery and naval gunfire. He had left only fragmentary remnants of his troops. He was himself sick, hungry, and wounded. After giving orders for one last fanatical bonsai charge, he decided to commit hara-kiri in his cave. At 10 a.m. on 6 July, facing east and crying, "Taneko Haika, Banzai! Long live the Emperor! 10,000 ages!" he drew his own blood first with his own sword, and then his adjutant shot him and Admiral Nagumo in the head with a pistol, but not before he said, "I will meet my staff in Yakusuni Shrine, 3 a.m. 7 July. That was to be the time ordered for the commencement of the final attack. This final attack was a matter of Imperial Japanese Army strategy. In his final order, Saito quoted the Senjin-kun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, a pocket-sized military code that had been issued to all soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. "I will never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive, and I will offer up the courage of my soul and calmly rejoice in living by the eternal principle." The Kurz writes, "Just after dark, the Japanese troops began assembling for their final attack. Beer and sake was consumed in large quantities, and all through the night of July 6, Japanese soldiers were probing the American front line, searching for any weak spot that they could find." The attack was desperate. The website The Daily Chronicles of World War II explains, "On this night in 1944 on Saipan, 3,000 Japanese troops, realizing that they could not defeat the invaders, hurled themselves against American lines in the largest bonsai charge of the war." Saipan called it a fearful charge of flesh and fire, savage and primitive. Some of the enemy were armed only with rocks or knives mounted on a pole. The Kurz writes, "It was about 04:45 on the morning of July 7th when they attacked. First came the Japanese officers, waving their swords over their heads and screaming at the top of their lungs, closely followed by thousands of troops. They came right through the gap between the 1st and 2nd Battalions. Major McCarthy described the attack as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except the Japanese just kept on coming. While they took massive casualties in the face of Army and Marine fire, the mass attack inflicted heavy casualties of its own. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, having implored his men not to give an inch of ground, emptied his 2 pistols into the attacking men, and then climbed aboard a jeep with a 50 caliber machine gun. When his body was found, the bodies of 30 Japanese soldiers lay around the jeep. Private Tom Baker fired his rifle until he was out of ammunition and then used it as a club until it was broken to pieces. Wounded, he insisted on being left behind. He was given a pistol with 8 rounds. The bodies of 8 dead Japanese soldiers were found near his body. The Japanese poured through the gap between the battalions and finally came to Ben Salomon's aid station. An award citation describes his actions. "In the first 30 minutes of the attack, approximately 30 wounded soldiers walked, crawled, or were carried into Captain Salomon's aid station, and the small tent soon filled with wounded men. As the perimeter began to be overrun, it became increasingly difficult for Captain Salomon to work on the wounded. He then saw a Japanese soldier bayoneting one of the wounded soldiers lying near the tent. Firing from a squatting position, Captain Salomon quickly killed the enemy soldier. Then, as he turned his attention back to the wounded, 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared in the front entrance of the tent. As these enemy soldiers were killed, 4 more crawled under the tent walls. Rushing them, Captain Salomon kicked the knife out of the hand of one, shot another, and bayoneted a third. Captain Salomon butted the 4th enemy soldier in the stomach, and a wounded comrade then shot and killed the enemy soldier. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Captain Salomon ordered the wounded to make their way as best they could back to the regimental aid station, while he attempted to hold off the enemy until they were clear. Captain Salomon then grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded and rushed out of the tent. After 4 men were killed while manning a machine gun, Captain Salomon took control of it. Salomon shouted to the enlisted medics of the station, "I'll hold them off until you get them to safety. I'll see you later." The Japanese attack penetrated nearly 1,000 yards, but after some 15 hours of often desperate hand-to-hand fighting, the attackers were nearly completely wiped out. The 105th suffered terribly. Saipan writes, "It had been a ghastly day. The 105th Infantry's 2 battalions had suffered a shocking 918 casualties, while killing 2,295 Japanese. One of the Marine Artillery battalions had 127 casualties, but it accounted for 322 of the enemy. The losses, killed and wounded, for the 2 battalions of the 105th amounted to 83%. Only 2 officers of the 1st Battalion of the 105th survived. Major McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, had survived, but all the company commanders and the entire battalion staff had been killed. But it had been worse for the attacking Japanese. Saipan writes that a final count of the Japanese dead reached the staggering total of 4,311, some due to previous shell fire, but the vast majority killed in the Banzai charge. Captain Love was among those who surveyed the battlefield after. He recalled, "We have been walking through piles of dead when the general gave a sudden start and then stepped over to the figure of a man who was bent over the barrel of a heavy machine gun. Very quickly, almost before I saw what he was doing, the general took out a knife and cut the Red Cross brassard from Ben Solomon's arm. Then he straightened up and looked around. There were 98 Japanese bodies piled up in front of that gun position. Salomon had killed so many men that he'd been forced to move the gun 4 different times in order to get a clear field of fire. There was something else that we noted too. There were 76 bullet holes in Solomon's body. When we called a doctor over to examine him, we were told that 24 of the wounds had been suffered before Salomon died. There were no witnesses, but it wasn't hard to put the story together. One could easily visualize Ben Salomon, wounded and bleeding, trying to drag that gun a few more feet so he'd have a new field of fire. The blood was on the ground, and the marks plainly indicated how hard it must have been for him, especially in that last move." The Los Angeles Times noted, according to the Army Dental Corps official history, published in 2000, more than 18,000 Army dentists served in World War II. Salomon was one of only 20 to die in battle. It is unclear how many of the wounded men Salomon had saved by holding the enemy in the brave stand. The island was declared secured on July 9th, although sporadic resistance and the horror of Japanese civilians throwing themselves off of cliffs to avoid being captured by Americans continued. It had been a desperate struggle, but capturing the island allowed air bases from which bombers could attack mainland Japan. Of some 31,000 Japanese defenders of the island, only around 1,800 had been captured alive. Salomon, O'Brien, and Baker were all nominated for the Medal of Honor. O'Brien and Baker were awarded the medal, but Salomon was not. The division commander, Major General George Greiner, wrote, "I am deeply sorry I cannot approve the award for this medal to Captain Salomon, although he richly deserves it. At the time of his death, this officer was in the medical services. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, to which the United States subscribes, no medical officer can bear arms against the enemy." Salomon was not even awarded a Purple Heart. But interpretations of the convention developed over time, and the Office of the Chief of Military History, believing the denial of the award to be an error, submitted the recommendation again in 1951, arguing that the prohibition against medical staff bearing arms was only for offensive operations, and that it was allowed in defense of staff and patients. The award was again refused, this time because the time limit for submitting World War II awards had passed. The Surgeon General of the United States Army again recommended Salomon in 1969, but no action was taken. Ben Solomon's actions seemed destined to go unrecognized. In 1997, Dr. Robert West, a graduate of the University of Southern California Dental School, was doing research for a chapter in a book that commemorated the 100th anniversary of the school, entitled Tommy Trojan Goes to War, when he stumbled upon the then nearly forgotten story of Ben Salomon. He found it tragic that he had never been awarded that Medal of Honor, and so he began a letter-writing campaign to Army brass and members of Congress. On May 1st, 2002, President George W. Bush finally awarded the long overdue honor. He said, "No one who knew him was with us this afternoon. Yet America will always know Benjamin Lewis Salomon by the citation to be read shortly. It tells of a young man who was a match for 100, a person of true valor who now receives the honor due him by a grateful country." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.